Welcome to Thriving Through, the podcast that pulls back the curtain on the world of independent consulting and shows you exactly what you need to do to build a successful consulting practice. I'm AJ, I'm your host, and each week I dive deep into the real life stories of self-employed consultants who have transformed their expertise into thriving businesses. Now, this isn't about glossy success stories or overnight miracles. This is about the grit, the strategies, and the resilience it takes to build a consulting practice that is not only financially rewarding, but also personally fulfilling. From navigating the feast or famine cycle to landing dream clients, from managing the unique challenges of entrepreneurship to creating systems that support your business, I'm covering it all. Each episode features a candid conversation with consultants who've been where you are. We share their stories, their insights, and the hard-earned lessons that transform their business into a thriving practice. So whether you're just starting out, looking to level up as a consultant, or wanting to reignite your passion for consulting, this podcast is for you. It's your weekly dose of inspiration, insight, and strategies that will pump you up and motivate you for the rest of the week. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and get ready to learn, get inspired, and most importantly, to thrive. On the Thriving Through podcast, I am interviewing Rick Maurer. Rick, welcome to the podcast. And let's start out by give us the 30-second elevator pitch on what you do.
Okay, great. All of my work focuses on two questions. Why do people support us and why do they resist us? And 30 years ago, I wrote a book called Beyond the Wall of Resistance. And I said, I think we're doing resistance wrong in organizations. And I was an organization development consultant. I did team building, all that stuff. But the phone started ringing because of that one book and because of that. And that still is what I'm doing. And I'm still doing it because it still excites me. I'm creating something new. I mean, just like 10 minutes before we started, and I go, oh, wait, here's a better way to do that. So I stay excited about that. So I work with generally people leading changes in large organizations.
Okay. Now, you mentioned, when we talked earlier, you mentioned that book changed your life.
Yes.
Could you share more about the key insights from that book and how they've evolved through your decades of consulting?
Sure thing. And by the way, I've written other books, and I think there's some reasons why this one had such a life of its own. And I just got to say, and one is the publisher got me a good publicist. So suddenly I was getting exposure in Wall Street Journal and Fortune. I was on NBC Nightly News once. I mean, it was just amazing. And the publicist really didn't understand what my book was all about. He just was a good salesperson. Honestly, months into this, when I was doing really well, I was in his office and he said, so Rick, tell me what that book is all about. And honestly, so there's that. But basically what it's about is I'm saying, look, people resist things for a good reason. We don't wake up in the morning and our feet hit the ground and we go, duh, who am I going to mess up today? I'm afraid of something, or I've got other plans, whatever it might be. And that's been the core of what I do. The way I talk about it has changed. So when I first started talking about it, I was talking about resistance, and I wasn't talking much about support. I was implying it, but it left people thinking that, okay, all you got to do is deal with the resistance and then everything will be okay. Well, that's not true. What's true is you got neutral. That doesn't mean they're going to be excited about what you're doing. And so I started thinking about it more as a sliding scale. And so, even if you and I were in a conversation about some work thing, that it would be a sliding scale between my getting excited about what you're saying to my being indifferent or disagreeing, and that's just life. And so it's a dynamic process. And so the more I work with it, the more I really try to teach. I try to treat it as something very, very fundamental and at its core very simple to understand. That doesn't mean it's simple to work with, but it's pretty simple for people to go, oh, I see. Oh.
What advice? Well, resistance is, in my experience, a big problem for self-employed consultants, because we're getting uncomfortable and we're doing things that we're not necessarily really skilled at. What advice would you give to self-employed consultants who to help them recognize and then work through the resistance that they may be feeling?
Okay. I think there's two categories of resistance, at least two categories, and I work with one of them. And what I work with is the relationship between you and me, and you might be the whole organization, but it's that dance floor, that field between us. And so I'm looking at support and resistance as it relates to each other. In other words, I'm not looking at the other person as a resistor. I'm looking at there's something in the process that's getting in the way. So if in talking to fellow consultants, I would say, all right, if you're concerned, you're afraid that you don't have the skills, you don't have this or that and that resistance, that can be really important and you ought to look at it, but my stuff doesn't really help there. It's more, but if, man, I get into a meeting with a client and I freeze up, or every time I say something, it just seems like I make matters worse, or I really hate it when the client goes, oh yeah, well, people like you, those kind of things is where a model, and I think a model like mine can be really helpful. It's just, working with it.
Okay, fantastic. I'm fascinated by the way you blend your music background with consulting.
Huh.
How does improvisation specifically influence your approach to helping organizations through change?
It's funny you should ask that. My horn is sitting right here. I can actually get, it's, first of all, I've always loved the idea of improvisation. So that generally serves me. It can also not serve me because I love the unknown, and so, but here's how it can serve me well is if I'm working with a client and it just seems like they've just planned a big event and something happens, it is not working out. I might freak out for a moment, but then I get excited about, what's going on? What could we do? Because if I freeze up or I try to say, no, let's just, muscle through this thing, it's not working. So what I really want to do is be responsive to what's going on in that moment. And the way that relates to music is I play in a couple of bands and I can call a tune and let's say we have a new drummer and the drummer starts doing something very different than I would have ever expected. Well, I can fight that, but it's gonna sound bad to the audience. They're gonna know something's wrong, or it can go, oh, okay, let's see what happens here, and so it can really help. Just the whole the one of the things I like about improvisers, there's an attitude of accepting things. That's what theater improv people do. They'll say yes, it's that kind of thing. So
Great. I like those. I mean, there are a couple of things that are really standing out to me: acceptance, flexibility, and then you've used the word excite a couple times. And what I especially love is turning what our mind might be telling us is bad and awful and turning that into how, instead of being anxious over this, how can I be excited about this? And
Yeah,
it strikes me that that is kind of key, that attitude is kind of key for us being able to handle difficult situations or situations that are going sideways, a whole different
yeah,
direction than we expected them to.
yeah. I agree. And I think I help my clients most when I can stay open to what's going on in the moment. But I have to be prepared. They've got to trust that I'm actually competent, and then my calmness is okay. But if they're freaking out and I really don't know what to do, then this is a mess. But I like it when they can say, "Boy, this isn't going well. What shall we do?" And I'll say, "Well, what about this? What about that?" And you can even start to laugh and start to, it's just, I don't know if I'm addressing your question well or not, but that's what I would do.
So I'm curious, when they're freaking out and you say you don't know what to do, how do you handle those situations?
That they
Because you're
say I
supposed
don't
to
know.
be the one that knows, right?
Oh. I'm not sure I would actually, I mean, if it was a situation I really didn't know what to do, and a big deal, I would admit that. But but generally, I'd be in a situation where a meeting isn't going as planned, let's say, or the person they expected to say X is not doing that, and they'll talk. That often there's a thing in jazz and in music of being in the moment and so I really try to be that with the client and say, okay, so look, so let's take a look at what's going on. I mean, how bad is it? And client, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is it? I just want to try to level set, and then I usually can come up with some things. Just I've been in business for a long time, so it's then I might say, hey, what would you think about doing blah, blah, blah? And I'm really trying to pay attention. Just as I'm looking at you right now, I'm paying attention. If you're rolling your eyes, I'm not going to try to sell that, you know,
Hmm?
that I'm trying to say, hey, what about this? What about that? And so,
Being in the present moment.
yeah. And it's a
Yeah.
dance with the other person even that group. And it's because you don't quite know how it's going to go. And so,
Mhm.
my hunch, I'm a terrible dancer, my hunch is that good dancers really can dance with their partner. What a concept.
Yes.
They
Well,
kind
you
of make
can
it work.
dance with the music because you're in a band
Yeah,
and you dance with the music. So you may not be a good physical dancer, but the concept of dancing is there.
it's there. Yeah,
Yes. When we talked earlier, you have a criteria for taking on work
yeah.
that I love.
Okay,
Will this assignment give me as much pleasure as playing music?
yeah.
How did developing this filter change your consulting practice and client relationships?
I good. I'm glad you asked. I What was happening is I had this one year where I had three really big contracts. I mean, if you'd looked at it, you go, whoa, this is good. I mean, they were lucrative, they were big. And I ended up hating all three. And one was simply because I said yes to something that I shouldn't have said yes to. It was something that didn't interest me anymore. So that's where my own energy comes in. Okay. The other two, it was management and labor, and they were acting in bad faith with each other. But in one place, I think they just wanted to be able to say, well, we brought in this guy, he's written books about it, and that didn't work. And so I was saying to my wife, to Kathy, and I said, God, maybe I'm not good at this anymore. And she said, well, I don't think you've lost your skills in the last 6 months. Maybe you were never any good. And fortunately, some people look at me not like you did, but they'll go, "Oh, you poor dear." And I go, "No, no, no, no." She knew that would get me laughing. And I thought about that and was talking to a colleague of mine and who said, "Hey, so why aren't you listening to your wife?" And I said, well, and what finally hit me was, look, I still want to work. I love working, but I had just taken, I had used to be a professional musician. I had just taken it up again. Uh, and Kathy had said, look, why don't you just back off? I mean, you could be retired if you wanted. Just back off a little bit and play more music. And what I thought, what came to me was, what if I only say yes to work that I think will give me as much pleasure as music? And often it's not the project, it's the person I'm talking to. And it's just like that. I mean, it happens in the opening minutes, if you will. And I'm not right 100% of the time, but I'm right most of the time. And that's made a big difference. Now it would have been harder earlier in my career because I wouldn't have had the courage to say no to so many things. I think I could have gotten that device when I was just starting, and I would have gone, yeah, right. What else you got? But I really wish I had done that earlier in my career. Having the book on resistance, which was really countercultural, I was really saying stuff that the business press wasn't saying, was actually very helpful because it put me on the spot. Like I'm advocating something that not a lot of other people are advocating. And so that already gave me a platform that was different. And if you were interested in that, that got me excited. Like, oh, here's a place where I could work. So.
There are a couple things about that I think are really important. One is you didn't want to do that anymore. That was one of those assignments that you hated.
Yeah.
I know so many consultants, especially in the early years, will take any project because they, I mean, and I took maybe one or two projects that my gut was saying not to take or that were outside my industry, and they were both dismal failures. Uh, how d- it's how does somebody get the confidence or the mindset to be able to step away and recognize that if we don't want to do a project or our intuition is telling us that it's not a good fit, how would you say, or how did you build up the confidence to be able to say no to those kinds of assignments?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And I hope my answer is worthy of the question. When I first started, I knew nothing. I'd been teaching school. I knew nothing about starting a business. And honestly, I picked up the yellow pages. This is back when people used actual telephones. And I would call a number and say, hi, I'm a consultant and I do that. And so I'm just assuming the person on the phone say, oh, you ought to talk to, and of course, I got nothing. But the ball started rolling, and I thought I've got to quit my job. I've got to just let the school system know by the end of July, or else the contract goes into effect. And I was talking to a friend who said, I'm not going to use profanity like I did when I talked with him. And he said, so if you go back to work, how are you going to feel? And I said, I'll feel like, and he said, so on one level, it sounds like you've already made a decision. And so I went on my own. But what really worked for me, and I got advice from somebody right away, is I live in Washington, D.C., and at the time, there was just a ton of work in federal agencies. Right this moment, there isn't. But there was, and there was a publication, Commerce Business Daily, that had all kinds of stuff, but also said these were contracts that had been awarded. And so I would call those companies, consulting companies, and say, hey, I see that you just won the da 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 da. I can do blah 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 if you need extra help. So I started getting work, and then they would call me. And for instance, one time they called and said, hey, could you do a thing on time management? And I said, sure. And as I'm doing the 2-day workshop, following what it said in the book about having 3 levels of stuff, and I thought, I don't do any of this. I don't, I don't want to teach this anymore. I mean, I can't say, I tried, and I thought, so what I started to find out by doing stuff is I don't want to do that anymore. And that started to help me focus on what I did. And also by focusing, especially with the resistance book, and it doesn't have to be a book, but the people knew me because of that there was an expectation when they called me. And so then it put me, or I felt in a better position to go, Well, and this still happens. People say, hey, we're really having a problem with, could you come do a training session? And my answer is no, because that probably is not going to work. But I know enough but I know that from my own experience of trying to do stuff where it didn't work. So some of that failure stuff was actually really good. And also gives me the confidence to go, you know, no, it's, and also, could I expand on this story?
Absolutely,
Okay.
yes.
So I got a call from someone I knew in a healthcare system where I had done a lot of work and a lot of work with the executives, and they said, "Hey, are you free on July 15th at 10 o'clock?" And and I looked and I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Good. Could you do a motivational speech on?" And I'm not a motivational speaker. I mean, I think sometimes people get motivated. That's not what I do. I'm not there to cheer people on.
Hmm.
And I said, well, why do people need to be motivated? And they said, well, we just went through a merger a few months ago and it's not working. And people trust you, Rick. So now they're blowing smoke and they're saying, people really, they listen to you, the leaders like you. And I think that was all true. And so could you please, do something? And I said, well, how, how much time could you give me? And they said, well, you could have all day if you wanted. And so I said, I don't know that I can do anything, but let me think about it. And can I bring in somebody else to help me plan something? And they said, sure. So I brought in my friend Regina Romero, and we individually went out, talked to people. And as we're trying to plan, said, this was going to be a meeting for all the leaders. And we're saying, God, that people are just depressed. And it's like, God, it's like somebody died. Like it's like they need a funeral. And I don't know if she said it or I said it, but we went, oh. So we used as our overarching metaphor a funeral. And we never said this to the client, but we thought, all right, what people want to do at a funeral is grieve. And so what we did is, and we're making this up as we go along, but we were trusting what we knew, especially we knew what wouldn't work, And so we put people with their new groups and said, all right, you got a flip chart there. Write down all the things that you gain from this merger, and then in the other column, all the things you lose. And as we went around the room, the lists were identical. And there was even one group that people thought that's the cool place to be. Their list looked like everybody else's. And you could see things start to change. And we didn't try to push them anywhere. This is my background in Gestalt working for me, is change happens when people are ready to change. It's called a paradoxical theory of change. And so we allowed people to talk. And at one point, we said, your pronouns have changed. You'd been talking a lot about them, and now we're talking about we. And you're also starting to talk about the present tense and the future tense. Are you ready to do some planning? And it was a question. If they'd have said no, we would have figured out something else. And they said, yeah. And we said, well, what about this? And we would try stuff out, and they go, yeah. And they went off and did it. And it was a huge turning point in the success of that merger. And it came from both Regina and I trusting when we knew what would fail. We had lots of experience in failure. I don't know if she's failed a lot, but I mean, we really knew what that was like. We knew what wouldn't work, and we had a client who trusted us, and so we were able to try this. And it's one of my favorite stories to tell because we were making it up as we're going along. Now there was probably 20 years of experience on my part, maybe an equal number of years on her part. Behind that, I'm not sure what we're going to do. But so I wouldn't have done that my first week as a consultant. So
Right. What I'm hearing here is the failures and doing things like in the early years when we do take something that doesn't fit or we do something that's a failure, that is actually a good thing because it gives us, like you said, you knew what wouldn't work. And then you were able to open up your mind and say, okay, we know what doesn't work. Let's try something different.
yeah, Yeah. And also, I agree 100% with what you're saying, but I also, in those early days, I learned what I don't want to do. Like I could teach time management perfectly fine, but I didn't want to ever do it again because it bored me to tears. If it had been something like, God, I got to do that. Or, boy, I've been doing this for the last 6 months, let me tell you, that'd be very different. But I didn't want to teach stuff that I didn't believe in.
Mhm.
And that made a big difference for me.
Yeah, you don't, that, that is an important consideration. I don't
Yeah.
want to do that because I mean, your energy and your ability to serve your client, if you don't want to do something, it's going to be there. It's subconscious, but it's definitely going to be there.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize until that year of the bad three projects when the one client said to me, Rick, you're phoning it in. And I would have hoped nobody could have ever said that about my work, but it was really eye-opening.
Yeah.
So
That would
yeah,
be like, that would be a punch in the gut.
it was. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned when we talked earlier the challenge of being known for too many things earlier in your career.
Yeah.
What advice would you give consultants about specializing versus maintaining flexibility or, wearing a lot of different hats?
It well, what worked, I'll tell you what worked for me and then what might work for other people too, is in the early stages, I liked that I could say yes to a lot of things. I felt like I could ethically say yes to things. And I would be doing things. I worked on a team in Guyana, South America for 2 months, like shortly after I went out on my own. And it was really helping leaders there learn how to do project management because there was a real brain drain in the country. And it was exciting, but I was working with people who were experts, economists and all of that. And I just learned so much. And I never would have put that on my resume that, oh, this is something that I could do. And so I liked that I was saying yes to a lot of different things at the time. What I wish I had done is been mindful and going and knowing earlier when to say no. Like, no, I don't want to teach that theory again. I've got nothing against it, but I'm not the person to do it. So, but I think having those, putting your foot in the water in a lot of different ponds, it's a tortured metaphor, sorry, but I think it's good in the first place if you don't quite know where you want to focus. But if you're entering the field and you're saying, I've studied the ABC theory and I love it and I'm certified in it, I want to do that, then I think trying to specialize makes a lot of sense. So, and that's just
Okay.
where I was. So,
Yeah. So if you're not quite sure, or say you're in you could do a lot of different things. Like I talked to a woman who's in HR consulting, and she could do a lot of different things, but what really lights her up
mhm.
is one certain thing. So in her case, specializing in that one certain thing is probably a good idea. But if someone else is saying, I can do all these different things in HR and I like them all, then your advice is to try them all and take a diverse range of assignments and see what you like and what works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I would say too is I happen to love free jazz. And free jazz is something where there just aren't many rules. And because it's so experimental and so playing around, but it's not a good way to make a living. I don't make a living doing music, but it's just if I was trying to make a living as a musician, which I did before, saying I'm going to do free jazz, I mean, I would have been broke almost immediately. So it's one thing to say I love doing this, but then you got to go. Is this important to anybody? Is it important in a way that people want to spend money for it, or can I talk about it in a way that people would go, oh, that really is important? Because if the answer is no, and I'm the only one saying, oh yeah, but see, AJ, that this really is important, and you're glazing over, then maybe I need to tamp down on that, you know.
Right.
So,
Right. It's got to be important and solve a problem for the client.
yeah, that's yes.
It has to meet a need for them. If it's just something that you think is really cool, or maybe it's a little too early. Like I would imagine when you wrote the book on resistance to change, you said that you were saying things that were not generally being said at the time. So
Right.
that there were probably times when I mean, you hit the sweet spot because you put the book out at a precise, perfect time.
Yes.
But do you think that if you'd done it maybe 5 years before, it might have been, a lone wolf and not gotten traction?
Well, probably, first of all, I would have had five fewer years of experience. There would have been that.
Mhm.
The likelihood I would have gotten that same publicist, I had another book that came out that I really liked a few years later, and I got a different publicist and somebody who really understood my work, and I got nothing.
Huh.
And yeah, and this person really worked hard, and so I was really lucky to have the publicist. Also, the publisher that I had for my resistance book, he had a way of work. Ray Bard is his name. It's now called Bard Press, and it's basically he said it's halfway between self-publishing and traditional publishing, and so he said, I make money when you go to print, and at the time there weren't ebooks, and so if you have 5,000 printed, I'm going to make X number of dollars. Okay, whereas self-publishing, I'd be making all the money if I sold it, and on the other end, I'd be making a royalty of some sort. But what it did is it gave me the structure of publishing a book, like feeling like a publisher, and working with somebody who really knew it, who could give me good advice and good feedback. I mean, that all of that would not have happened 5 years earlier. 5 years earlier, I've been so grateful to have a publisher want to do my stuff, which was the case. And
Mhm.
I said yes to stuff that I probably shouldn't have. I mean, it was nothing bad. Nothing bad happened, but I realized it wasn't getting to the people that I worked with. So it was not getting in front of people that already were inclined to hire me and that. So
Right. Would you recommend that a consultant write a book, or under what circumstances would you make that recommendation?
it's I would recommend writing it if you just got to write a book. I mean, you just, because I don't know that there's the need. When my first book was called Caught in the Middle, and it sold a decent amount for business books, but I didn't get a lot more work out of it. And what I did notice that my IQ jumped by 25 points because I'd written a book. People were listening to me differently. Okay, so I'm
Uh-huh.
being facetious, of
Mhm.
course. So, so that was a good thing. Today, I just don't know how much cachet a book has unless you're all have a way of being up there in that top tier, because there's no barrier to getting published now. I mean, you
True.
and I could talk about a book right now, and I know people who could edit for me. I know people who could design. We could have it out by Friday. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
and there's no adult supervision. So there's nobody there to edit, and nobody there to say, a million other people have just said what you guys are saying. It's a little too tempting to get out there. And so I think it makes it harder to get exposure these days. But I think writing, and also I think probably doing YouTube stuff, can be really, really helpful. I have stuff on YouTube, but I haven't taken it really seriously. But the stuff I keep seeing is that would be a good thing to do. And the nice thing is if you're going to work with people, it puts you in front of them. They get to see you. And so, so she's saying that. That's really interesting. It's probably a faster way to get somebody kind of interested in who you are, and then maybe shorter things in print. And then if a publisher comes to you and says, hey, I'm going to give you this amazing royal advance and royalty, then you go, well, yeah, okay, I could write a book. So
Okay. Yeah. Good advice. So basically, the book isn't necessarily the end all be all. And in today's world, build up a reputation and thought leadership on YouTube. And then maybe there's an opportunity for a book, but the book isn't necessarily the answer to or the best marketing strategy in today's world.
I think that's true. Uh, I mean, there's got to be exceptions to that, but by and large, it's not. It's well, first of all, when I wrote Beyond the Wall of Resistance, there were bookstores. I mean, that somebody could actually pull off the road and go into a little shopping center and say, "Hey, do you have Rick Maurer's book?" I mean, that's just a thing of the past, and I realize there are bookstores, but there's not a lot. And so, and there's not a lot of local radio either. I would get on local radio shows all over everywhere, and once again, people could say, oh, hey man, yeah, I'm on the way to work. I'm going to see if they got that book. So it was just a different world for all that kind of stuff. And that's why I don't know if it's just YouTube, but I think there's some people who probably have really good luck with other social media. I'd be very careful because there are a ton of people who want to tell you that they've got a magic answer for you, and they don't. And but I think I'll just give you one story. One of the things that I was on. I don't go on Facebook very much, and somebody had done something, and went on, and I see this guy has an ad for ear training, which is a thing where you're hearing pitches and you can actually sing them, play them, which as a musician is really an important thing to do. And I do it a halfway decent job, but it's not as good as I'd like it to be. And here this guy's talking, and he said, I got this course, and it's just starting up, it's 30 days, and I'm selling it as a discount, I think like $29. And I thought, okay, I can take it on my own. I mean, it was super cheap, but I like what he was saying. So it didn't feel super cheap. And so I've been taking it, and I think he's the real deal. But what he's got is a 6-month program where he's actively involved and doing all this work with you on a particular instrument, and it's $6,500. So his entry thing is like, you can hardly say no to it, but then the real offer is really big. And I had to stop and think, like, do I really want to spend $6,500 for something that's a hobby for me? And the answer is no. So
you did the 29, and you weren't a candidate for the big ticket item.
yeah, and there were things he was saying about the big ticket that if I were a professional musician right now, I might go, I really do need that. Like he had a testimony from a woman who plays in one of the major symphonies in the world. And she says, I get stage fright. And here's what he helped me do. Well, I don't tend to get stage fright. So, that wasn't, and I don't play the same instrument. So there were a lot of reasons why that just I was not the ideal customer for that. So.
Right. What keeps you curious and engaged with your work on resistance and change after all these years?
I can tell you, I've been working on it right now. I'm doing a webinar on the 25th, I think, and it's ways to get organizational changes unstuck. And I hadn't been using that term, and I was in a mastermind group, and I was talking. They started using getting unstuck, and I thought I really like that. And when I tell people they're doing what you're doing, they're nodding their head. They get a picture of what that's like. So I thought, all right. What can I do in that realm, because it really interested me. And when I was talking to other people who I respected, it was really interesting to them as well. So even just actually about an hour before our call today, I was actually about 2 hours. It's been a couple hours this morning on like, oh yeah, here's something else I could say. Oh yeah. So it keeps me using the same model that I developed, but finding these new angles that actually, it's really fun for me. some people like their gardens and all of that. This is really fun for me. So
And is this a webinar that you're going to do for specific clients? Or are you going to do a webinar and I mean, how are you going to market your webinar?
this is going to be a public webinar, and I will promote it in my email list, which is I don't know what it is now. It's about 3,000, I think, and then I've got a LinkedIn list of about 4,000 of people that I have a direct contact with, not just followers, and that's where I'll promote it. I'm also sending, and so I'm charging. I forget what I'm charging. I'm charging $49, something really small. But there's some people who helped me because I send out a weekly newsletter, and I said, hey, and if you help me on this, I'm doing this thing sometime in March, and I'll give you free admission. So I'm doing that, and I'm sending another thing out to ask a different question, and anybody who helps there can get free admission. And so my hope is that it's successful, and that maybe I can do it, 2, 3 times a year. But I'm also hoping that I can go deeper, that people go, I really like that, but I want something where we roll up our sleeves and actually are doing the work together. And so I've created a thing, I call it Changes on Life Support. And so how do you avoid that? And so I've come up with a process for that, which is, I think can have a really big impact, but it doesn't take a lot of time. So they're not hiring me. So what I like about doing these strategic work sessions is that a team would say, hey, we really got to get better. A lot of our projects are on life support. People go to the meetings, but not much gets done. I had a CEO say, all I was getting was malicious compliance. And so,
That's a good term, malicious
isn't that a
compliance.
good term? I love it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so people would it would be a team taking it together, and it would be some pre-work so that they walked in really knowing where they're stuck and kind of why they're stuck. And then we can talk about, all right, so what do you do about that? And how do you turn things? And then, so we'd use probably a 3 or 4 hour block of my talking a little bit, them doing some work, my talking some more. So at the end of that half day, they can say, here's what we're going to do. And then if they want to call on me for a follow-up, that's great. But I don't want to go in and be the consultant on call who's there on Monday morning and leaves on Friday. I've done stuff like that. I just don't want to do that anymore.
Right.
So
Yeah. I love your idea of getting, when you get some help from people on your lists, your connections, offering them free, the webinar for free, because they're more invested and they're very likely going to show up.
yeah,
And I'm going to have you back on the podcast after you do this, because you are using, the experts out there in the world on, marketing say that webinars, some people say webinars are a great way to get, people invested in your business and to get them into a more higher ticket program. There are others that say webinars are, 2010 or whatever. But I will be interested to see how this doing a public webinar for a small amount of money works to attract the kind of people that really would benefit from a half-day workshop that's very interactive.
I'll be
Yeah.
curious about that too. So, because I simply don't know.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I have one last question. You
Yeah,
talked about a mastermind, that
yeah.
you were in a mastermind, and that your messaging, the way you were talking in the mastermind, kind of hit on something that made their eyes light up, and it led to you thinking about this unstuck aspect. What kind of mastermind was it, and would you recommend masterminds?
It's This is a mastermind that I was invited into, and it's run by someone who has a marketing company and markets, basically the kind of resources that people like me would use. And I I loved this one. I mean, this is a closed mastermind, so it's really, the idea is he was keeping it small and he was sending invitations to not a lot of people. So it didn't feel
Mhm.
like this is y'all come sort of thing. And so far, I mean, I really like it. And so I had a hot seat moment where I could talk about whatever I wanted. And I just said, hey, I'm thinking about this. And people just jumped on it. And somebody said, hey, my consulting firm works with these kind of organizations and they do strategic planning. They do it really well, but they never follow the plan. And he said, I'd love to be able to say, hey, I know this Rick Maurer guy, and I think he could save you a whole lot of time by saying, hey, look what you're doing. And so we had like an hour and a half drive back to an airport afterwards, and that's what we talked about. So the fact that there's an excitement there. I was in a mastermind years ago, and the problem was it was, I don't know, 5 or 6 of us. We had 5 or 6 minds there, but none of us were masters at marketing. And
Mm.
so I think that title gets thrown around indiscriminately. And I've done it, I did it somewhere else, and I think we may have called it that too. And it sometimes was helpful to have conversations, but it wasn't the same as being in a room where somebody said, here's what we're doing, and here's what's working for us, here's what didn't work for us, and that there's something there. And so if you could find a group like that, that could be really, really beneficial. But I think, just anybody, because any of us could just say, hey, I'm doing a mastermind Tuesday afternoons, bring the beer. I mean, it's just, so.
Right, right. Yeah. So masterminds are a beneficial thing, but beware of how the mastermind is structured and who is hosting the mastermind.
What I would do, and this is me especially, I'm an introvert. I mean, I like people, I like working with people, but I work really well one-to-one. So where I've gotten great advice over the years is talking to one person at a time, you know, and it's just, I don't know, often for me, that's a really good use of time. And sometimes be sitting in a room full of people, I get distracted by, oh God, don't tell me about your grandkids again. Oh God, I have little tolerance for that. So I like the focus, for me personally, I like the focus of I'm talking to 1 or 2 people, and I trust their judgment. So,
Right? One last question.
yes.
Would you recommend to a self-employed consultant who is fairly early in their self-employment career, would you recommend they get a coach or a mentor?
I didn't have one. I think I would have been, I have two answers to that. One is, yeah, if I'd had the right coach or mentor, I think it could have really helped my career. Could have helped, you know, somebody could say, so Rick, why did you turn that down? Or why did you say yes to that? I mean, just even those kind of questions would be helpful. And then somebody would say, here's something you ought to do. In fact, I had been told I was doing information interviewing when I first started and got hooked up with this consultant who turned out to be a friend later. And this is for computers. And he said, all right, get a pack of index cards. And he said, right after this meeting, take one and write down my name and my phone number, anything else, and just something you remember me by. And then on the back, write today's date and what we talked about, just quickly. And he said, you're going to start to get, and one of the things you should do while you're talking to me, he said, Rick, say, is there anybody else I should talk to? And so over the next few months, I started to have this stack of index cards, and I still like the idea of index cards. There's something for me that once something goes into my computer, even though it might be a very sophisticated CRM, I think that's what it's called, or just spreadsheet, it's better if I got a card in my hand. There's something about, but at any rate, so I got really good advice there that really served me well. So yes, I think having people who can give you good advice is good. I think if you're just starting out, you may not have money, and that can create some problems. But I did find in the early days if I, called somebody and said, hey, I'm just starting and, you know, AJ said to give you a call, I really could use some help. And I'm just, and I'm not going to sell you anything. I want help. And then you stick with that. You never say, well, I'm offering da 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 da. You really stick with that and then say, hey, thank you. And is there anybody else I could talk to? I think that to start off with might be a really good thing to do because it gets you talking to people who in a different circumstance just could have been your client and maybe someday they will call you, but the purpose is you want their honest opinion. And what's really good about that is they're the kind of person who could be hiring you as opposed to one of your colleagues who said, oh, I love the fact that you got butterflies on your business card. Oh, that is going to be great. No, I want to find out from that chemical engineer who I want to work with, does she like butterfly? That.
Right.
Now, so yeah.
That is great advice, is to, get out there and talk to your ideal client. Because what better way to get to know their problems and pain points than to actually talk to them?
Yeah.
And I find so many consultants when they're trying to define their niche, and myself included, you're kind of in your head trying to figure out what you think your ideal client needs and wants and what mistakes and problems they have.
Yeah.
But you're just having an inner dialogue. So getting out there and talking to people, and it doesn't need to be out there physically in their office, it can be done virtually.
Right.
But that is probably what maybe the single most important piece of advice that you've given today is that. So for people who are just starting out, and actually not even just starting out, if somebody is starting out, or if they plateaued, if they're having trouble getting to the next level, get out there and talk to your ideal clients and not sell them. You're not trying to sell them on anything. You just want to know about them.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say is I would like this much time, period, so that they know what they're saying yes to, And I think an hour is probably way too much time to ask for.
Yes,
But
absolutely. Yes. Well, thank you so much for all of your wisdom today. I have enjoyed our time together. And that's a wrap on our podcast for today.
cool, good. This is a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of Thriving Through. I hope today's conversation has given you not just inspiration, but practical, actionable insights that you can apply to your own consulting journey. Remember, building a thriving consulting practice isn't about following someone else's blueprint perfectly. It's about finding your own path and staying true to your vision while learning from those who've walked similar roads. If today's episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear about it. Share your biggest takeaway on LinkedIn and tag me. Leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps other independent consultants find our community and join this conversation. And don't forget to hit subscribe to ensure you never miss an episode. Each week, we'll bring you more honest conversations and practical strategies to help you build a consulting business that works for you. Until next time, keep pushing forward, stay curious, and remember, you're not just surviving in consulting, you're thriving through it.